morning, my name is Frank Callahan. I'm a lifelong resident of Worcester, Massachusetts. I was born here in 1952, and I come from a long-time family. In fact, I'll be talking a little bit about my family in this talk about Union Hill today. And just recently retired from Worcester Academy, where my title was Director of Plan Giving. I did the estates planning for alumni for the school. But I also am a history buff, and so I became the unofficial historian of Worcester Academy and did several talks to the school, both in classrooms and to assemblies, about the history of Worcester Academy, which goes back to 1834. In fact, in this talk, I'll talk a little bit about that. And that's pretty much it. Thanks. This is a talk on Union Hill, which is one of the numerous hills in the city of Worcester, Mass. It's on the east side, and it is a smaller hill on the east side, and it's connected to another hill called Vernon Hill, which is on the same geographic or geologic formation. But there's other hills in the east side that I'd like to mention just to clear up some confusion. So for instance, to the east of Union Hill is Grafton Hill, which starts behind St. Stephen's Church and is in between Grafton Street and Hamilton Street in Worcester. So that's Grafton Hill. And then there's another hill that's a little bit to the north of Worcester Academy called Oak Hill, and that's roughly Wall Street area and the area where the El Morocco restaurant used to be. But there's even another hill on the east side called Crow Hill, which is opposite the Ecotarium entrance and going over towards Plantation Street. So those are just some of the hills in Worcester. But the one I'm going to be talking about today is the Union Hill, and I'll talk about the way its name came up. And so why don't we go into the first slide. And I hope you can see this up close on your TV set. But the area where the Union Hill is at the northern end of a long geological formation that starts roughly at around Union Station, goes all the way down to the Millbury line. And in the days 400 years ago, it was called Sagatabscot by the local tribes. And the name is significant. It means hill of rocks, and that was important because a lot of the rock on the hill is what is called schist, which is, if you look at the Greek root word for the schist, it means something that can be split into different parts, and that was important to the local Nipmucs, and in particular the Packagug tribe lived right on Sagatabscot Hill, because they could go take that rock and split it and make it into arrowheads or pestles or axe heads, things like that. So that was very, very important as a resource for their way of life. And so why don't we go on? I have another shot of, early shot of Sagatabscot. And as I mentioned, the local natives use this quite a bit. And the Packagug had 3 locations on the hill at that time. So the life of the Native Americans was disrupted with the arrival of the colonial settlers. And the first ones came in the 1670s, but left with the outset of the first of the French and Indian Wars, the first one being the King Philip's Wars. And they left, and then another settler came whose name was Digory Sargent. And he was a veteran, actually, of the King Philip's Wars. And he and his family purchased 80 acres of land at what became Union Hill. And he was married and had 5 children. And they were living on these 80 acres of land. And this, of course, there was tension with the Native Americans because their lifestyle was disrupted. And so there was another of the French and Indian Wars coming up. This one was called the Queen's Anne Wars. It was right around the turn of the 1600 to 1700 time frame. And so the chief of the tribe was Sagamore John, and at first he did get along with Digory Sargent, but the tensions started to come up. And by the way, this mural that I'm showing right here is at the entrance of the Vernon Hill School on Providence Street, opposite Vernon Hill Park, and you can see it's a depiction of Digory Sargent and Sagamore John. So as I mentioned, the war came up, another one in the series of the French and Indian Wars, and this one again was called the Queen Anne's Wars. And the head of the militia, John Winthrop, came to Digory Sargent, or sent a messenger, and said, you have to go, it's too dangerous to be here. And there was even a young squaw who came to him and warned him that things were, the tensions were extremely high, but he ignored her. And so soon thereafter, Sagamore John came with some of his braves, and they attacked Digory Sargent in his house. And Digory Sargent fired at them, and they fired back, and they wounded him. And when they wounded him, they ran into the house and killed them and scalped them. And then they took the 5 children of Digory Sargent and his wife out of the house. And it was in the middle of the winter. There was a snowstorm going on. And they headed for the western section of the city of Worcester, what was then called the Tacit Hills. And today we call it Tatnick. But so they were headed actually towards Canada. But Digory's widow was complaining that she was too frail to go on, and as they were going on, one of the braves stepped out of the file and tomahawked her in the back of the head and killed her instantly. So the children were taken to Canada, and they were ransomed, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. And by the way, this mural, another one that's at the front entrance of the Vernon Hill School, is by Will S. Taylor, painter, and I'll talk a little bit more about Will S. Taylor. But I'd also like to finish the story about the attack that Winthrop and his group of militiamen came to see what was going on, and they saw the blood in the cabin and Digory's body. And so they set out after Sagamore John, but because it was a blizzard, they lost the tracks, and so they came back to Digory's house. And in the meantime, another set of braves came to attack the house, and they saw Winthrop and the militiamen coming back. So they opened up a trap door and went down into the cellar and closed the trap door above them. And Winthrop and his militiamen put a blanket down, slept overnight, got up the next morning and left, not knowing that the tribe was there. So the children were up in Canada, and they were ransomed, and 3 of the children chose to come back to the United States. And one of them, the oldest daughter, Martha, married a man named Shattuck, and they actually moved back to the house that the Sargents had owned, Digory Sargent had owned, and they were there for a brief period of time. But in 1713, they sold the house and the property, the 80 acres of land, to Jonas Rice, who was significant because he was the first permanent settler of Worcester, Massachusetts. And there's actually a marker in the neighborhood at the corner of Vale and Haywood Streets indicating that Jonas Rice was the first permanent settler of Worcester, Mass. And I'll be talking a little bit more about him in a bit. 2 of the children of Digory Sargent chose to remain in Canada, and they were in the French part of Canada. And at some point, the family name changed to Langlais. And the Langlais family are well aware of the story of Digory Sargent and have come down to visit on occasion, and they've seen the mural at the Vernon Hill School, and have actually come over to Worcester Academy, which is on Union Hill, and are very thankful that a school is on the land where Digory Sargent was a resident. So here's some more murals. These ones are at the Worcester East Middle School, and I call this the back end of Union Hill because it's down at the corner of Dorchester Street and Grafton Street. And of course, Jonas being the first permanent settler was significant because of the fact that he was the first parent of a Caucasian child in this then town of Worcester, Massachusetts. He was the first teacher because he taught his children. He also was the first administrator in the town and the first judge in the town of Worcester. So that's why Jonas Rice is significant. And these murals were painted by Jenne Magafan. And she was an identical twin. And both she and her twin were married to other painters, and they were from the Midwest. And they gained commissions from the Works Progress Administration to paint murals in public spaces like libraries and courthouses and schools. And so I always assumed that these murals were commissioned by the Works Progress, or the WPA. But it turns out that I was entirely wrong. They were commissioned by the St. Woolston Society, which is a local foundation, and it was founded by Sarah Knowles, the widow of one of the founders of the Crompton Knowles Company. And the St. Woolston Society still exists today and is a benefactor, I think, mostly to the Worcester Art Museum. And by the way, St. Woolston is the patron saint of Worcester, England. And so it's kind of significant to Worcester, Massachusetts. That's probably how they came up with the name. But the other interesting thing, this is a little sideline, is that Jenne Magafan was an identical twin with her sister, and they were not only identical twins, they were mirror image identical twins. So if, for instance, one is left-handed, the other one is right-handed. If one has a cowlick that goes clockwise, the other one has a cowlick that goes counterclockwise. If one had a mole on their right leg, the exact same mole would be on the left leg of the other twin. So just a little sideline there about Jenne Magafan. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I had always assumed that the Will Taylor murals that were at Vernon Hill School were WPA commissioned murals. And again, it was the St. Woolston Society that commissioned those murals. So now we're going to get into the naming of Union Hill. And this is a lithograph that the actual title is right here at the top here, View of Worcester, taken from Union Hill. And this is available actually for sale at the Worcester Historical Museum. And this depicts Worcester in the 1830s. And if you can see down in the lower part, that's the Blackstone Canal there. On the bottom left-hand side, there are a couple of little buildings, and that was one of the locks on the canal, and you'll be pleased to know that that's Kelly Square. One of the legacies of the Blackstone Canal is that we've got poor traffic because a lot of the roads went to bridges that went over the canal. So for instance, there are 7 roads that went over the bridge on the, at Kelly Square, and hence we have Kelly Square in Worcester, Massachusetts. But you can also see in this lithograph the Lady Carrington, the barge that would take the supplies from Providence up to Worcester, and they would be delivered to Worcester. And then the reverse would happen, where goods and supplies would be sent from Worcester down to Providence, Rhode Island, and hence the ocean. And so Worcester became a thriving town. And in fact, you can even see in this lithograph the tow horses pulling the Lady Carrington up. But at the very, very bottom of it, you can see the outcropping of land right there, and that's Union Hill. And I'm convinced that the reason that this lithograph was commissioned was because the owners of the land on the top of the hill wanted to sell the land as a commercial, as a residential area that would be a very upscale residential area. And the name Sagatabscot is too many syllables, and so making it Union Hill was a much better, simpler idea. And so the reason they commissioned this was to say Worcester was a growing town with you know, a lot of thriving community because of the Blackstone Canal, and that people would want to come to this very nice neighborhood on Union Hill. And by the way, this is pre-industrial revolution. If you notice in the lithograph, there's no smokestacks or you know, brick buildings for industry. That came later. So here's a map, and I'm convinced that the owners, the developers of the hill commissioned this map at the same time that they did the lithograph. And this goes back to 1836, as does the lithograph. And they did a design of the neighborhood for the potential buyers. And it's significant because of the fact that it shows the dimensions of Union Hill. And as I mentioned earlier, this Union Hill is the same hill as Vernon Hill, but it was separated because of the ideas of these real estate developers. And so at the bottom of the map, I hope you can see this, is Vernon Street, and it turns over into Winthrop Street. But then on the bottom left-hand side, or in the middle, say, going diagonally, is Water Street, right next to the canal. And you can see a little body of water right there, which is the pond for the lock, to fill up the lock and raise the canal, the lock, etc. And so this is a great map because of it shows the dimensions of Union Hill. It also does a rough scheme for the layout of the streets. It wouldn't be permanent. I'm going to talk about that in a couple slides coming up. But the streets coming from Water Street go up to the top of the hill and then bear right, just the way they do today. And at the top of the hill, in the center of the plan of the developers, was a park that they envisioned called Union Square. And this was to be the best part of this upscale neighborhood. And so the houses that were around this envisioned park had the most land. So it had 100, you can't see this probably on the map, but it's 100 feet of frontage and 200 feet back. So roughly half an acre of land that they could build an opulent mansion on the top of the hill, looking both at the park and then back down the hill towards the town center of Worcester, Massachusetts. And so that was the envisioning of the Union Hill. And why did they pick the name Union Hill? Well, that was a very patriotic name in the northern states of the United States of America. And the reason Union was so important up north was because of the fact that after the War of 1812, the federal government did not want to trade anymore with their previous opponent, England, or the United Kingdom. And so they passed laws that had high tariffs. And the high tariffs incentivized trade within the country as opposed to trade overseas, and in particular United Kingdom. And so the North was all in favor of it because they were developing industry and so wanted to trade with the South, which was an agrarian society. And the South was upset about it because of the fact that the high tariffs made it more costly to export their cotton to England. And so they were up at arms and tried to nullify the tariff laws. And so the Northerners like Daniel Webster, who was the senator from Massachusetts, actually gave one of his most famous speeches where he said, "Liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable." And so union was very important. So this was hopefully a draw by the developers of Union Hill that this was a significant neighborhood. In fact, I should go back to the previous slide because along with calling it Union Hill, they also named the streets after the early presidents of the United States. So they envisioned it having an Adams Street and a Washington Street and a Jefferson Street and a Madison Street. So again, that was all the patriotism that they were trying to draw potential buyers. And then of course, the Union was the name of the forces from the North during the Civil War. So again, Union was a very significant name up north. Here's another map that was done probably in the late 1840s into the 1850s. And again, it has the rough layout of the streets. And this time on the left-hand side, I hope you can see it, it's called Harrison Street. And at the bottom on the left-hand side is Water Street, of course. And the Harrison Street today goes straight up the hill from Water Street all the way to the top of the hill. In this map, it envisions that Harrison Street, the name remains the same as soon as it reaches the crest of the hill and turns to the right going south. But today, that is called Providence Street, and that's going back many, many years that it was called Providence Street. But there's some other streets in this map from the 1840s that are the actual names of the streets. So there is on Union Hill, there is a Columbia Street, and that is roughly the area that the Columbia Street is located on. And then in the another part of the hill, and this wasn't part of the original design by the owners at the top of the hill, was the lower part of the hill. I call the lower part of the hill down by Grafton Street. It's the northern part closest to where the train station is. And there's not the theme of the presidential names of the streets. In the streets in this little section of streets are named after Quakers. So we have a Mott Street at the northern end of the hill. That's after Lucretia Mott, who was a suffragette and a Quaker activist. And of course, William Penn, who was the founder of Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker. But there's also a Barclay Street. There's Robert Barclay down in the bottom right, and he was a theologian in the Quaker denomination. And then there's we're losing the theme here. It's a crazy quilt of names up at the northern part of the hill. There's Waverly Street, which Ivan Sandroff, who wrote a book called Your Worcester Streets, he was a columnist for the Telegram back in the 1940s, and he said that Waverly Street was named after a novel by Sir Walter Scott. It was the first historical novel. So we have a Waverly Street, but we also have natural phenomenon. We have Mount Etna, which is a volcano over in Europe, and then we have a Coral Street in that section of the city. I cannot figure out what they were thinking when they did the names, but otherwise the names go back to the patriotism of Union Hill. This is a map that if you went to the Registry of Deeds and see it, it's the 1856 plot plan, and whenever you look at a document about a parcel on the hill, it refers back to the 1856 plot plan. And it's significant because of the fact that it maintains what was that park on Union Hill in that original map going back to the 1850s. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happened to that, was envisioned to be that park. But there's Providence Street on the left-hand side of the 1856 plot plan. But what's so interesting about the 1856 plot plan is that if you took that and superimposed it on a Google map of the neighborhood, it's exact. That the parcels that were envisioned in 1856 are the parcels that are there at the top of Union Hill today. And so that's a document that's back at the Registry of Deeds, and kind of fun reference to look at. So that park, we're getting into the Worcester Medical College. What happened with that park? Well, a building was built on it back in the 1850s, and it was called the Botanical Medical College, and it was founded by a doctor named Calvin Newton, who believed in botanical medicine, which at the time was controversial. It said that flora and floral extracts could be curatives. At the time that was controversial, but he persisted, and he was able to persuade people to help him not only found the college, but build this building at the top of Union Hill where the park was envisioned. And he hired the architect Eldridge Boyden, who had created the design for the Mechanics Hall and the Cathedral of St. Paul, among other things. And I believe that he was copying along the lines of the castle down at the Smithsonian. I have it up in the top right-hand side here. And that's one of the original buildings, if not the original building in the Smithsonian Institution. And you notice that it also has turrets, and it has the Palladian windows that have the circular parts on the top. And so that was the Botanical College for only 3 years. Calvin Newton, the founder of the college, passed away in 1853, and he was the moving force for the college, and so it went out of business shortly thereafter in 1854. I should also mention that this building with all the towers on the top of a hill was very prominent, and when the trains were coming into Worcester, the first thing that they saw coming into Worcester was looking up at the top of the hill and seeing this prominent building with these big towers on it. It was empty for a few years, and then a couple of years later it was acquired by a Baptist women's college, and they started up in 1856, and they were very ambitious. They acquired a lot of land surrounding that original small campus or park on the hill, because at that point the hill was largely empty. And they also put wings on the sides of the original design by Eldridge Boyden. And they had great ambitions to create a college along the lines of Mount Holyoke College out in western Massachusetts. But in 1857, a panic struck the entire country, and the banks were failing, and they were not loaning money, and businesses were really pinched, and so they were not getting the support to keep the college going. And so they went out of business in 1860. And the building remained empty for another 4 years. And it was leased in 1864 by the federal government. And it became a hospital for Massachusetts soldiers who had been serving down south where the battles were taking place in the American Civil War. And the thinking was that by 1864, the carnage had been so terrible down south that they couldn't keep up with all the casualties down south. And so they sent the soldiers back to their home states to recuperate. And so this was leased by the federal government towards the end of the war. And rather than have the soldiers or the patients reside in the hospital, they stayed in barracks that were built for the hospital. And hopefully you can see these barracks in this photograph. And there were 14 of them. Each one of them was 160 feet long. They were 25 feet wide. They were 15 feet high at their pinnacle. And so that's where the soldiers or patients resided. They also had their food there. The only people that used the actual building itself were the doctors who stayed there and did their surgery there. They had a library in there. And so that was the Dale General Hospital. By the way, it was named for the Surgeon General of the state of Massachusetts. And there was another Civil War hospital also in the Boston area. Please notice how empty the hill is at this point. That's probably Dorchester Street, where that person is standing right in the middle of the lane. And where that picket fence is, that's Providence Street. In fact, we'll see that in the next shot. And this shows a little bit more of a close-up of the Dale General Hospital and the wings on it. And you can see a little bit, I hope, some of the figures, both on the porches and to the side. This has been cropped off on either side, but you could see the entire photograph, you could see more of the patients in the hospital and some of the administrators. And of course, this picket fence right here is Providence Street in Worcester. And so this building is where that park was. And by the way, if you're interested in finding out more details about the Dale General Hospital, a local historian, Sandy Bishop, does a lot of research into medical care in the Worcester area, and she wrote a paper about Dale General Hospital, and that also is on the city website along with the Ivan Sandroff book about your Worcester streets, etc. One of the soldiers who was a patient at the Dale General Hospital, his name was A.C. Spaulding, he was a sergeant, did a drawing of the building. And you can see even some of the barracks. And again, this has been cropped off, so you can't see some of the rest of the picture has some of the soldiers on crutches and amputees and things like that. But he did this drawing. And towards the end of at the end of the Civil War, the soldiers put candles in all the windows for the surrender at Appomattox. It was something like 10,000 candles that were put in every window in the entire tower, and it was for miles around. People could see the windows being lit up by the patients of the Dale General Hospital. I just wanted to mention that as soon as the Civil War was over, only after 14 months, the federal government shut down the lease, and the building again became empty, and I'll talk about that as we go on. This is a bird's eye view of Providence Street in Worcester, and this is in the 1870s. And you can see the area right at the middle there of the what was the Dale General Hospital. And Worcester Academy actually moved into that building 4 years after the Civil War ended. They moved up the hill in 1869. The school actually goes back to 1834 and was originally down about a mile south of Worcester City Hall, and it had 60 acres of land down there, and it was called the Worcester County Manual Labor High School. And the boys who went to that school, it was a Baptist denomination school, they worked on the farm in order to help pay for their way to get into Brown University, which was the college to train Baptists. But it fell on hard times and moved to a second location in the 1850s where the Worcester Police Station is now, and was there for about 15 years. And then the opportunity to purchase the building at the top of Union Hill became available, and so the entire school moved into that one building. Both at that point it was co-ed, and so all the faculty and the administrators and students all lived in the building. And so we'll be talking more about that later on. But so this is what the Union Hill looked like at that time. It had some population. Some of the owners, we were in the industrial age at this point, revolution I should say, and a lot of factories at this point were down on Water Street. It's on the top left-hand side as you're looking at this bird's eye view. And so this is the area where the workers and the factories were, and the owners of the factories, like the Lymans and the Gordons and the Grattans and the Knights, had moved up the hill into opulent mansions at the top of Union Hill. The most prominent of the factory owners was George Crompton, who was the founder of the Crompton Loom Works. And he was actually industrial genius. He had over 100 patents for looms, which made textiles, cotton and wove cotton and wool. And he actually won the silver prize at the 1867 Paris exhibition, and he was inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame in 2007. And so he had his company down in the Canal District, and we'll talk more about him in the next few slides. But here's a picture of the Crompton Loom Works, which that building exists today. I have a copy of it on the right-hand side here, and we know it today as the Crompton Collective, and you know, the best known of the companies in there is the Birch Tree Bread. And but this lithograph that's in color shows the building probably back in the 1870s, and it looks like that they added on the fourth floor. They transformed into another area for building looms, and then also they expanded it out. So for instance, on the left-hand side of the lithograph is this entrance, but in today you can see that same entrance is in the middle of the building. So they built a large expansion of the building on the left-hand side, going all the way up to Harrison Street. As you're probably familiar, the Crompton Collective is at the corner of Harrison and Green Street. And so that's what the company was doing. And of course, he was very successful and had married a woman named Mary Pratt, who was born in London, England. And they went on to have 9 children. And so with this large family, they wanted a very big house to take care of all the children. And so they bought a dozen acres of land at the top of the Union Hill, roughly where the land was of Digory Sargent. And they had Eldridge Borden, the same architect who had done the Mechanics Hall and the Dale General Hospital, design a building for the Crompton family, and they called it Mariemount in honor of Mary Pratt, Crompton's wife. And it's believed to be one of the early Tudor mansions in the United States of America. And I hope you can see some of these smaller pictures of how opulent it was. It had heavy woodwork and fireplaces in a lot of the rooms, and statues, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is a shot of it shortly after it was built in 1865. And here's, going back to that same bird's eye view from the 1870s, here's a depiction of what the Mariemount looked like. And on the left-hand side, you can see Providence Street, and up at the top it says Union Street. Well, that today is called Dorchester Street. Down at the bottom, we can see Winthrop Street, and of course that turns into Haywood Street on the right-hand side. But you can see the actual family home, Mariemount, and you can also see other buildings on the property. And they loved their horses and carriages. They had an immense stable, and they had coachmen, and so it was a very, very nice building for the Crompton family. And here's a map. And by the way, this is from a memoir of the Crompton family that's available for viewing. You can't borrow it from the Historical Museum or from the Worcester Public Library. But this is a map done by the family of the Mariemount. Providence Street is at the bottom of the picture, and then you can see the layout and some of the little roads there. Those are still entrances to the property. And you also, I hope you can see on the left-hand side, there's a little rectangle. And what that rectangle was a tennis court. One of the daughters found out about the sport of tennis in New York City and brought the equipment back up to the family. And so they created a tennis court on the estate. And the family believes it was the first tennis court in the city of Worcester. And the Crompton boys took up tennis like crazy, and they played it all the time. They went on to Worcester Academy, as did some boys directly across Providence Street named Jones, and they were part of the family of Edward Davis Jones, who was one of the founders of the Wall Street Journal. These were younger cousins of Edward Davis Jones, and they played with the Crompton boys tennis avidly, and went on to Worcester Academy, played it there. And then the Joneses went to Brown University and became ranked amateurs at the national level in tennis. You can also see that there are extensive gardens on the estate. On these pictures right here, I hope you can see them. It was so much gardens, there was a greenhouse, and they had ponds on the estate and that type of thing. The Cromptons became friendly with a sculptor named Randolph Rogers, who was a world-renowned sculptor. He actually had his studios back in Italy, and the best known of his sculptures is called Nydia, the Blind Flower Girl of Pompeii, and that's one of the copies is at the Detroit Institute of Art, but there's another copy at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And he also designed the Columbus doors, which are on the east front of the U.S. Capitol. And the Crompton family was so close with Randolph Rogers that one of the Crompton boys was named Randolph Rogers Crompton. And then Randolph Rogers returned the favor to the Crompton family. He was the sculptor for the Civil War statue on the Worcester Common, and he took the head of George Crompton, the owner of the Crompton Loom Works, and put it on the sailor in the monument. Not the body, but the head is George Crompton on the Civil War statue. So that's a fun piece of trivia for you. The only remnant of the Crompton estate that survives is what I call the Crompton Wall, which is both along Providence Street and Winthrop Street. And there is proof about it because of the fact that there's a book, a memoir by S.N. Berman called The Worcester Account, about growing up on Union Hill. And in that book, he talks about the wall at the Crompton Estate. And there's also letters by the daughter of Abercrombie, who was the most notable headmaster at Worcester Academy, and she talks about the Crompton Wall, which exists today. However, if you have been going through the neighborhood recently, you'll notice that they've widened the intersection of Winthrop Street and Providence Street, and they actually push back the wall about 10 feet to make an extra lane for the streets there. But the Crompton Wall still exists. This is the history of Union Hill. This is the part 2 of it. I actually did the original talk back in 2013 in 2 different parts. And this shot is on Providence Street looking north or downhill. And actually you can see one of the towers of the original train station at in the background of the picture. And of course, in the 1870s, the primary form of transportation was the horse and wagon. And it was still not heavily populated on the top of the hill because of the fact that it was not easy to get up such a steep hill. And so we'll talk about what happened and why it became so heavily populated within the next few years. And the primary reason was the streetcar. The streetcar arrived in 1893, and originally they were fairly small. They were wooden, and they actually had to have horses help pull them up to the top of the hill, but they got bigger and stronger as time went on, electrified. And originally they were open, and people had to put hay on their feet to stay warm in the wintertime and that type of thing. But then they put windows on them, and they were immensely popular. The primary form of transportation in the city of Worcester was the streetcar at the end of the 1800s, and it was very convenient. It was a nickel to go from the top of Union Hill all the way down to City Hall. It took you only 15 minutes, and so that made it very, very convenient to come up to the top of the hill. And that meant that it was available not just for the wealthy owners of the factories down at the bottom of the hill, but also for the factory workers. And so I'm going to talk about the types of houses that they lived in, but I'm going to do a little intro slide here first. And so what I'm talking about here is ships of the line. The reason these sailing ships were called ships of the line is when they went into battle, they did offense where they went broadside against each other. They'd line up against each other. So that's why they're called ships of the line, because they lined up against each other. And they didn't know how to play defense. They could only play offense. And so they would shoot at each other practically point blank. And so the more cannons that you had, the more effective you were of destroying your opponent. And so they had cannons not only on the first level, but then they went to a second level and then to a third level. Well, these were called decks. So 1 deck, 2 deck, 3 decks. That's the origin of the name triple decker, is the ships of the line. And the triple decker became the primary form of residence on Union Hill because of the streetcars made it so easy to get up to the top of the hill. The factory workers who worked down at the Blackstone Canal area, the Canal District we call it today, could easily get on the streetcar and come all the way up to the top of the hill. In fact, in this photograph that you see down at the bottom, you can see the 3-deckers going up along the side of the hill. And these were primarily owner-occupied. Again, it was the factory workers who were the owners of these 3-deckers. And typically they lived with their family in them. So for instance, on the first floor it might be the factory worker, on the second floor it might be the parents of the factory worker, and then a sibling or cousin might live on the third floor of the 3-decker. And they were large. They had front porches and back porches. You can see that in this photograph right here, where they could leave their laundry out to dry. They had little yards in the back where they could grow a garden for some extra food and that type of thing. And they were built to last. They had hardwood floors. In fact, in the next slide, you can see a schematic from a book about three-deckers by Marilyn Spear. This schematic shows the layout of a typical three-decker. And to me, they were as big as a ranch house in Worcester, Massachusetts. They had a large living room and kitchen and dining room. They had 3 bedrooms oftentimes. And again, they had the front porch and the back porch. So they had, space between the buildings themselves and then air flow in the back, et cetera. So it was quite healthy. And here's a couple of shots of a couple of three-deckers on Providence Street. This is number 26 and number 28 Providence Street. You can see again the picket fence, a little bit of a front yard, and the nice porches on the street. And so not only were they're factory workers, but there were also a lot of the factory workers were largely immigrants. And so in this shot, here's some of the early immigrants that lived on Providence Street. And the gentleman on the left-hand side is Charles Martin Callahan, who was my grandfather. And then his father, Martin Callahan, who was an immigrant from Queens County, Ireland, which is now called Laois. Martin came here as an immigrant and eventually started a horse and wagon business down on Temple Street in Worcester for the people going to or from the train station. And then his son and his brother, who's also was named Frank Callahan, they founded the Callahan Brothers Funeral Home, originally down on Temple Street, that still exists today, but is under different ownership, but still a family business. But a lot of the original immigrants that lived on Union Hill were Irish immigrants. But as time went on, there were other, before I get to that, I wanted to talk about the ownership, that the Callahans owned number 30 Providence Street. You can see that at the top on this little map right here. And then next door neighbor was the Drennans, and that's James Drennan, who was a captain in the Civil War and a colonel. And he was actually Martin Callahan's first cousin. Both of their mothers were named Gohagan, and so they first cousins lived next door to each other on Providence Street. So this is an insurance map. And again, the three-deckers were owner-occupied. On the right-hand side, I have a photograph of the mortgage certificate for this is my mother's family, and this is not on Union Hill, but on my mother's side, they owned a three-decker down by Sacred Heart Church on Cambridge Street. And each month they would go to People's Savings Bank and make their payment to the bank until they paid that mortgage off. And so we have that document in our family records. So this is very typical of the owners of the three-deckers, that they were not only the owners, but they were, they had their family members living in the buildings. And then a little bit later on came other immigrant groups to the neighborhood. And again, one of the immigrant groups that's best known for Union Hill was the Jewish immigrants. Their world was largely down on Water Street, where it was both commercial area for them. And then they oftentimes lived in the buildings above the shops on Water Street. But with the advent of the streetcar, then they started buying less expensive land at the top of the hill. It was more expensive to buy land down by the factories, but it's less expensive to buy it on the top of the hill. So they came up to the top of the hill. But other immigrants came up to the top of the hill, Lithuanian groups, and we'll talk about the churches that they have in the area, as we will with the Jewish families. And then Polish families lived on the hill. Those two groups, the Lithuanians and the Polish families, were not only on Union Hill, but they were going farther south down into Vernon Hill area and even down into Millbury Street area. So they were a significant part of the hill. And again, it was a situation where they owned the three-deckers, and they were workers in the factories down at the Crompton and Knowles and the Wyman and Gordon companies. They worked down there and then took the streetcar back up to the top of the hill. This is that same bird's eye view of the hill that I showed before, and I just wanted to show you this is in the 1870s, and there weren't too many churches on the hill because there wasn't much of a population. In fact, Worcester Academy students were escorted by their faculty members downtown to attend church on Sunday at churches on Main Street or on Pleasant Street area, just because there were very few churches on the hill. And I also put in some arrows about Ledge Street School that I'll be talking about in the next few slides. And that was, Ledge Street was a very tiny little street right off of Water Street, which is at the top left-hand side in this picture. And I also have a picture of or have pointed out a church at the corner of Waverly and Coral that still exists here. And then down at the bottom here's the Worcester Academy campus, and it's called Union Street. That's now Dorchester Street. And then right down the middle, of course, is Providence Street. There's up on the top left-hand side is Water Street. So we'll be talking more and more about the churches in the neighborhood. Want to just show you the very northern tip of Union Hill, and there was a Providence Street school, and it was all the way at the very bottom of Providence Street. If you can see at the top here, there's Grafton Street. On the left-hand side is Water Street, and then the diagonal right down the middle is Providence Street. So there was a public school, a grammar school, right at the foot of the hill, right at the intersection of Water Street and Grafton Street area. And there's also a Swedish church that I pointed out here, and I'll show you some depictions of that in the following slides, and what became of that building is part of the story of Union Hill. So here's some churches that are on Union Hill. The one on the top left-hand side is St. Casimir Church. That was for the Lithuanian families in the neighborhood, and that's on Providence Street. It's at what I call the lower end of Providence Street, and that was sold by the diocese back in 2009, and is now the Church of the Pentecost, and I believe the congregants are Ghanaian families living there, and it's quite an active church. And then we have at the top right-hand side Shari Torah Synagogue. That building still exists, and that is been converted over into condominiums, and it's at the lower end of Providence Street, almost where 290 is. And then here's a drawing in the bottom middle of the Swedish Congregational Church that pretty soon after its founding, the congregation moved down to Quinsigamon Village, and it became the Sons of Israel. And in fact, the population of the Jewish families on Union Hill was so significant that at one point there were over 6 synagogues on Union Hill. And in fact, one of them was in a building that is, I showed that on the map in the previous slide, was a Methodist Episcopal church until 1913, and then in 1913 it became the Sons of Abraham Synagogue, and that's at the corner of Waverly and Coral Street, and is now the Revival Fountain of Life Church right in the neighborhood. But it just gives you a feel for some of the churches that are in the neighborhood. And then here's a photograph of the Providence Street School that I showed in a previous slide. Again, that was at the very northern tip of Providence Street. And then here's a photograph on the bottom left-hand side of the Ledge Street Street School, class of 1943. And you can see some of the kids that are in the neighborhood in that period of time. And then there's another school that still exists today. It's still an active school in the city of Worcester public school system, Union Hill School. The original building was built in 1893, but the city of Worcester population was booming with all these immigrants coming to work in the booming factories in the city of Worcester. So only 4 years after it was built, the original building was built, they put on an addition that's closer to Dorchester Street in Worcester. So for instance, on the top one photograph, you see the entrance is on the left-hand side. When you look down below, the addition is put on, and that same entrance is in the middle of the building. And in fact, in the 1960s, they put on an additional wing going farther down south on Chapin Street. So it just gives you an idea of the growth of the population of the city of Worcester and the public school system. So for instance, Providence Street School was growing so much, rather than put on an addition, they just simply built a second building right next door right in the play yard. And they did the same thing with the Ledge Street School, where the original building was on the right-hand side. You can see it in this photograph. It's a small building on the extreme right. And then a few years later, they built a second building for the Ledge Street School. And rather than putting an addition on and disrupt things, they simply built another building right on the same property. And things were growing so much in population that if you remember in that original depiction of Providence Street School and the Firehouse, they were separate buildings. They just kept on building on Providence Street School until it attached itself to the fire barn. And this tells you how close it was to Grafton Street, because you can see a sign in the photograph for Grafton Street and 122 going out towards Grafton. So it gives you an idea of how much growth there was in the city of Worcester. Here's another shot of the Ledge Street School. And on the right-hand side, we have a picture of the Worcester East Middle School. I call that the back end of Union Hill because of the fact that it's behind all the parts of the hill that are facing downtown. And that's at the corner of Grafton Street and Dorchester Street. And that's the building that has the murals of Jonas Rice in the front lobby. And this just gives you an idea of the tremendous growth in population with immigrants. This is a picture of the Providence Street School class of 1907. And it looks like there's a couple of faculty members, and it sure looks like to me that they are Irish women that are the teachers of the students, and the kids to me look like they're from middle parts and eastern parts of Europe in the photograph, that they're coming from Poland and Lithuania, coming to Worcester with their families and living in the three-deckers. Oop, I jumped ahead. So I wanted to get back a little bit to Worcester Academy, because it's an institution that's still at the top of the hill. And on the top left-hand side, we have the bird's eye view depiction of the campus. And when the school moved up to the top of the hill, it was roughly around 3 acres. And then in 1882, Daniel Webster Abercrombie became the principal, and he's the moving force and the biggest name in the history of Worcester Academy. He started buying property behind the building on the top of the hill. And as he bought the property, he would build another building. And you can see what the campus looked like in the 1890s when he was still the principal of the school. And at the bottom, this is a map of the campus around 1910. And you can see how what was originally about 3 acres had become about 7 or 8 acres. And he kept on building. So for instance, there originally was a gymnasium in the basement of the Walker Hall, and it's not shown in this map, but he built where number 10 is, that circular area, he built a gymnasium complex there. And then the campus, the historic campus of Worcester Academy, has grown since then. So for instance, right here is Penn Ave that splits the main part of the campus with on the right-hand side is what is called Kingsley Laboratories, a science building. And when I was a student at Worcester Academy, I'm class of 1971, I crossed Penn Ave to go to science classes. Well, the city deeded over that little stretch of Penn Ave to Worcester Academy. And then in the meantime, the Academy has acquired some of the 3-deckers that were behind the Kingsley Laboratories. So the main campus is almost 13 acres of property. And what's not shown in this little map is the Warner Theater, which is the marquee building on the campus. What happened was that the Academy bought about another 10, 12 acres down on Vernon Hill area south of Winthrop Street, and built Gaskell Fields there. And so that area that was a ball field became available. And so the gymnasium and the Warner Theater were built in that area right there. Another institution that was on the hill was a fire barn, and you can see in the bottom right-hand side the fire company. This was a building that was designed by Stephen Earle, who did a lot of churches here in the city. And as you can see, it was built for the horses in the barn, and they had the fire cars were able to fit into the bays right there. Well, today's fire engines are much too big for those garage doors, so it is no longer a fire barn. It's actually an ambulance facility for UMass Medical, but it was a fire barn at the top of the hill, and that's on Providence Street, a little bit to the north of Dorchester Street, going down towards St. Vincent's Hospital. And then St. Vincent's Hospital acquired the Crompton Estate back in the early 1950s, and they built their complex of healthcare on what had been the Crompton Estate starting in the 1950s, and expanded out until they had about 15 acres of land. And as you well know, the hospital moved downtown in 2000, and so that area has become available, and Worcester Academy, over a period of the last couple of decades, has acquired that property and now has a ball field there. The eventual plan is to build a gym complex there in that area. But just to give you a little bit of background, the original St. Vincent's Hospital goes back to 1898, and that was a little bit farther down the hill on the other side of Winthrop Street near Vernon Street. And that building was demolished after the hospital moved up to the Crompton Estate, and there's a medical arts building in that area today. Believe it or not, Hanneman Hospital was on Providence Street. It was founded in just somebody's house, one of the big old mansions on Providence Street. It was only there for a few years until it moved over to Lincoln Street, and still exists today as a surgical center as part of the UMass medical system. But kind of an interesting footnote that Hanneman Hospital was originally on Union Hill. There's literary connections to Union Hill. So S.N. Berman, I mentioned him in passing at the end of the first section where I talked about the wall of the Crompton Estate. He was a Broadway playwright and wrote Pulitzer plays, etc. And he wrote that memoir, The Worcester Account, about growing up on Providence Street, and it's well worth reading it. And then, of course, Stanley Kunitz, who was the poet laureate not once but twice for the United States of America. He lived around and about Union Hill. I think he was born down on Water Street area, lived briefly on Union Hill, and then the family built the house on Vernon Hill on Woodford Street, which is parallel to Providence Street down by Gaskell Field and Vernon Park area. And that's actually a literary site where the Kunitz family built that house, and you can see that there's a plaque out in front of the house today if you want to see it sometime. There's other connections to the arts. Cole Porter went to Worcester Academy. He was there for all 4 years. He arrived in 1905 and lived in Dexter Hall Dormitory and graduated in 1909. Went downtown and visited the theaters there. And this is him in a crowd of other Worcester Academy students watching a football game. And if you look very closely, you can see the Union Hill School behind him in that photograph. There's another tunesmith who grew up on Union Hill. His name is Charlie Tobias. He wrote a number of bestsellers. One was Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anybody Else But Me. And they also did, I'm going to mess this up, Those Lazy, Crazy, Hazy Days of Summer was another one of his songs. And turns out that he was one of 3 brothers, and they were also Tin Pan Alley tunesmiths and lived on Union Hill also. This is Grogan Spa, which when I was a student at Worcester Academy was a beloved place. Ma Grogan was loved by all the Worcester Academy boys. And when we had breaks in the morning, we'd go over and have coffee and donuts. And Grogan Spa was at the corner of Dorchester and Providence Street. And the boys were so familiar, you can see in these photographs, they went behind the counter and served themselves coffee and donuts and things like that. And they were very friendly with Ma Grogan. And when I worked in the alumni office at Worcester Academy, I had many conversations with alumni about whether or not they paid their bills with Ma Grogan. So there's always lots of long stories about that. What was significant to the Hill, of course, was in the 1960s, they started taking parts of the area by eminent domain in order to create Interstate 290. So for instance, Providence Street, the bottom part of Providence Street is no longer. The highway goes through that area. And so a lot of the houses, so for instance, the Callahan family house at number 30 Providence Street is no longer there because of the fact that it was taken by I-290. And this is just a depiction of some of the takings. And another institution that was taken was that Swedish church was taken by eminent domain. That was the one that was at the very lower end of Providence Street. That's probably where the exit for the highway is today. By the way, in this photograph, there's a big block of a building on the left-hand side. I believe that's the Worcester Cold Storage building, the building that had the tragic fire in 1999 where 6 firemen were killed. So that's how close it is to Union Hill going towards the train station today. And another prominent building that was taken was the Fox Mansion. That was on Ingalls Street, which the exit for on 290 going from Kelly Square, that was taken there. And that was owned by the Fox family. They were prominent manufacturers down in the Canal District, and there's actually a Fox Street down in that area. And the Fox Mansion was owned by the Zabinski family. That name might be familiar to you because Gene Zabinski was the prime motivator for getting the Pawtucket Red Sox to come to Worcester. He started that postcard campaign to bring the Red Sox to Worcester, Massachusetts. And his reason for being so involved with Worcester because his family lived in the Fox Mansion. And this is a shot of what the house looked like. And this is from a book about Polish families in Worcester. And this is the final slide. This is just showing a little girl being upset by the taking of the properties at the lower part of Union Hill to create I-290. And this was probably back in the 1950s this was taken. This photograph was taken. So it really transformed the neighborhood. The downside is that it's blocked off from a lot of the rest of the city. The upside is that Union Hill is close to everywhere. You can get onto a highway onto 290, get you to the Mass Pike. You can get to Grafton Street, that gets you to the Mass Pike that way, or 122 in Grafton, or you can get to the Mass Pike going straight south onto 146. So the highways have damaged a lot of the neighborhood, but at the same time, it's an extremely convenient area to live in. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.